My name is Farah Cook, and I'm 25 years old. Everything was ready. The ticket, the visa, the savings, all of it lined up perfectly. My acceptance letter from the University of Edinburgh was printed and folded in my carry-on. And 3 years of night shifts at a grocery store had finally added up to something real. I had saved every single pound, every single dollar, every single coin that rolled under the counter. I skipped birthday dinners. I wore the same shoes for 2 winters. I told myself over and over that the sacrifice was worth it. And it was. It was all worth it until it wasn't. The night before my flight, I was in my room doing one final check. Passport, ticket confirmation, bank statements, student visa. I had gone through that checklist so many times I could recite it in my sleep. Everything was in order. I set my alarm for 4:30 in the morning, said a quiet prayer, and let myself feel something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real warm, unguarded hope. I fell asleep smiling. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of my bedroom door opening. My mother was standing there, her arms crossed, her face carrying that expression I had learned to fear growing up. Not anger exactly, but something colder. Control. She held my passport in her hand like it was nothing, like it was a grocery receipt she was about to throw away. I sat up in bed, and the first word out of my mouth was a question I already knew the answer to. I asked her what she was doing. She told me I wasn't leaving. Just like that. Flat, final, no room for negotiation. She said, "Word for word, you're not leaving. Who will cook and clean?" I remember those words hitting me somewhere deep in my chest. Not because they were cruel in an obvious way, but because they revealed exactly what I had always been to them. Not a daughter with dreams, not a young woman who had worked herself to exhaustion for a chance at a future. I was a housekeeper. I was a caretaker. I was a convenience. My father appeared behind her in the doorway and added quietly that my younger sister needed me there. My sister, who was 17 and perfectly capable of boiling water, apparently needed me more than I needed my own life. I begged. I am not ashamed to say that. I sat on the edge of that bed, and I begged them. I told them how long I had saved, how hard I had worked, how this opportunity would not come again. My mother told me to go back to sleep. My father didn't look me in the eye. They took my passport and closed the door. And I sat there in the dark, listening to the silence of a house that had just swallowed 3 years of my life whole. I missed my flight. I watched the departure time come and go on my phone while sitting on the kitchen floor, still in my pajamas. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I went in my room and I cried for 3 days straight. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in films, but the kind that leaves you dehydrated and hollow. The kind where you wake up and for half a second you forget what happened, and then it all lands on you again, like a wall collapsing. On the 3rd day, something shifted. I don't know what it was exactly. Maybe it was exhaustion turning into something harder. Maybe it was the moment I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the girl staring back at me, red-eyed, defeated, shrinking. And I thought to myself, no, not like this. I got up. I washed my face. I put on real clothes for the first time in 3 days, and I made a decision that would quietly change everything. I was going to the embassy not to complain, not to cause a scene. I went because I needed to understand my rights. I needed to know whether what my parents had done was something I had to simply accept, or whether there was another path I hadn't seen yet. I took the bus alone, which sounds small but felt enormous. After 3 days of barely moving, the embassy waiting room was cold and fluorescent, and full of strangers staring at their phones. I took a number, and I sat down, and I waited. When my number was called, I walked up to the counter, and I explained my situation as clearly and calmly as I could to the officer on the other side of the glass. I told her about the passport, about the flight, about the 3 years of savings. I was prepared for sympathy, but nothing more. What she told me instead made my hands go numb, because what she told me wasn't just information. It was a door I had never known existed, and it had been there the entire time. She looked at me with steady eyes, and she said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said that a passport issued to an adult belongs to that adult alone. That no parent, no family member, no authority outside of the government has the legal right to withhold it. And then she told me exactly what I could do next. I walked out of that embassy a completely different person than the one who had walked in. What that officer told me at the embassy counter was simple, legal, and devastating to everything my parents thought they had control over. She explained that withholding an adult's passport is considered a form of coercion in the eyes of the law, and that I had every right to report it and demand its return through official channels. She slid a printed form across the counter and told me to fill it out carefully. She also gave me the number of a legal aid organization that handled exactly these kinds of cases, family situations where adult children were being unlawfully controlled. I sat in that waiting room for another hour, filling out every line of that form with a hand that had finally stopped shaking. When I handed it back, she looked at it, stamped something, and told me someone would be in touch within 48 hours. I thanked her and walked out into the afternoon sunlight, feeling something I had not felt in days. Not happiness exactly, something quieter than that. Clarity. The call came the following morning. A woman named Sandra from the legal aid office introduced herself and asked me to come in that same afternoon. I did. She sat across from me in a small office lined with filing cabinets, and she listened to everything without interrupting once. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk and told me that my case was straightforward. She said that a formal written request would be sent to my parents, requiring them to return my passport within 72 hours or face legal consequences. She also helped me contact the university to explain the situation. The admissions office, to my complete disbelief, told me that given the documented circumstances, my enrollment could be deferred by 1 semester. I sat in Sandra's office and I cried again. But this time it was entirely different. This time it felt like something opening rather than something closing. My parents received the legal letter on a Thursday. I know this because I was in the house when it arrived. My father opened it at the kitchen table, and I watched the color leave his face slowly, like water draining. My mother read it over his shoulder, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw her go completely silent without choosing to. Not the silence of control, the silence of someone who has just realized they miscalculated badly. Neither of them spoke to me directly. My mother set the letter down on the table and walked out of the kitchen. My father stared at the wall for a long time. By Friday evening, my passport was placed on my bed without a word, without an apology, without a single acknowledgement of what they had done or what it had cost me. I booked a new flight for the following month. I used the extra weeks to reconfirm my student housing, update my visa dates with Sandra's help, and quietly begin the process of separating my life from theirs in ways that went far beyond a plane ticket. I opened my own bank account they had no access to. I changed the contact information on all of my university documents. I told my sister privately what had happened and why I was leaving, and I told her that if she ever needed help, she could call me anytime from anywhere. She hugged me for a long time and didn't say much, and I understood that hug completely. The morning of my new flight, I woke up before my alarm. I got dressed in the dark, carried my suitcase to the front door, and called a cab. My parents were awake. I could hear movement in their bedroom, but neither of them came out. No goodbye, no last attempt to stop me. No apology waiting at the door, just silence. And I realized standing there with my hand on the door handle that I had spent years interpreting their silence as love expressed poorly. But it was never love expressed poorly. It was simply the absence of it. And I had been filling in that absence with excuses for as long as I could remember. I walked out of that house and I did not look back. At the airport, I went through check-in, security, and reached the departure gate with my passport in my own hand. And then something happened that I was not prepared for. A customs officer near the gate glanced at my passport photo, looked up at me, and paused. She asked me to step aside for a moment. My stomach dropped immediately. After everything, After all of it, I thought something was wrong. But she looked at me carefully and said she recognized me. She had been the officer who processed my original booking months earlier when I had done a pre-clearance check online. She remembered my name. She said she had wondered what happened to me when I never showed up for my original flight. I told her briefly, standing right there in the departure hall, what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her stamp, pressed it into my passport with firm finality, slid it back across the counter, and said simply, "Have a wonderful life." I studied in Edinburgh for 3 years. I graduated. I built a career, a circle of people who chose me back, and a life that belongs entirely to me. My parents and I have not spoken since that morning I walked out the door. That is not a tragedy I am performing for sympathy. It is simply the honest ending to a story that needed one. I saved for 3 years to study abroad. My parents took my passport so I couldn't leave, and I left. Anyway, if this story moved you,